Today, in this video, we're going to dive into the story of Amos, a minor prophet from the Old Testament, but with a huge impact. Amos was simple, with no religious background, but he had a sincere heart and an urgent message from God for the people of Israel. He reminds us that God doesn't care about status or appearance, but about truth and justice. So come with me as we explore Amos' journey and the lessons that still resonate today. Amos was, above all, a man of the countryside. He wasn't a priest or a member of the lineage of the prophets. He was a shepherd and a gatherer of sycamore figs, living a simple and honest life in the small town of Tekoa, located about 10 kilometers south of Jerusalem. Tekoa was not a center of religious or political influence in Israel, but God often chooses those who seem small for great tasks, as a way of revealing that power and wisdom come from Him, and not from social position or human knowledge. In Amos 7 verses 14 to 15, he himself states, "I am neither a prophet nor a prophet's disciple. I am a herdsman and a caretaker of sycamore trees. But the Lord took me from following the flock and said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" This confession brings up an important point. Amos was called directly by God. This means that he had no specific training, schooling, or family background to exercise a prophetic role. Instead, it was an unexpected and clear call, a summons from the Lord Himself to an urgent and special mission. Amos was sent to the northern kingdom, which was experiencing a period of economic prosperity under the rule of Jeroboam II. It seemed like a good time for Israel, but this prosperity brought hidden problems. The rich prospered at the expense of the poor, and justice was corrupted, with leaders neglecting the vulnerable and manipulating the laws. Instead of using their wealth and position to promote justice and the common good, many in power abused the system, and idolatry was at every turn. The sincere worship of the God of Israel had been replaced by empty rituals and sacrifices that were performed mechanically, without any real commitment to love for one's neighbor and holiness. Amos' courage is inspiring. Even though he was an outsider among the religious and political elite, he did not hesitate to confront Israel's leaders with harsh and prophetic messages. His words often shocked the public, as they exposed the sins that were socially accepted. God had called an ordinary man, without influence or status, to speak out against a corrupt and idolatrous system. Amos' example is a reminder that value to God is not in titles or position, but in a heart willing to obey. Amos teaches us that God does not choose based on what the world considers important. He seeks people who are willing to hear and respond to His call. Like Amos, we may be called to tasks for which we feel unqualified, but with God's strength, we can fulfill God's purpose, making a real difference even in the most challenging situations. During the time of Amos, Israel was experiencing a time of unprecedented economic prosperity. Under the reign of Jeroboam II, the northern kingdom of Israel had expanded its borders and acquired considerable wealth, becoming a strong and respected nation among its neighbors. The economy was booming, and cities were developing, with luxurious buildings and magnificent temples. Military success and prosperity led to a period of external stability and growth for Israel. However, this prosperity concealed deep internal injustices and abuses that deeply concerned God. While the elite prospered and accumulated wealth, the poorest sections of society faced very difficult living conditions. The rich enjoyed privileges, expanding their estates and living in ornate palaces, Amos 3 verse 15, while the poor were exploited and neglected. There was no justice in the courts. Corrupt judges and leaders used their power to benefit the rich and subjugate the less fortunate. Oppression of the poor was common practice, and workers were poorly paid or even exploited without any form of protection or justice. The greed of the elite overrode any sense of compassion and solidarity, resulting in a society marked by inequality. In addition to social injustice, Israel's spirituality had become superficial and ritualistic. Although the people maintained religious sacrifices and festivals, true love and obedience to God were absent. Religious rituals and ceremonies were practiced frequently, but without sincerity or reverence. God observes, through the words of Amos, that the sacrifices and offerings were empty, for they did not reflect a heart turned toward him or the values he preached. In Amos 5 verses 21 to 23, God rejects these empty ceremonies. I hate, I despise, I have no pleasure in your feasts and your solemn assemblies. And though you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not be pleased with them. This harsh condemnation reveals that the Lord was not satisfied with a religiosity of appearances, but desired a living and transforming faith that promoted justice and love. The kingdom of Israel was also deeply entangled in idolatry. Foreign gods such as Baal and Asherah were worshipped alongside Yahweh, the God of Israel. Idolatry had become so widespread that many believed they could worship God and these idols at the same time, as if faithfulness to the true God did not require exclusivity. This mixture of religious beliefs and practices further contaminated the faith in Israel, hardening hearts to the true voice of God. Religious syncretism, which mixed foreign practices with the instructions given by God, weakened the people's commitment to holiness and righteousness. In this context of injustice, superficial religiosity, and idolatry, God raised Amos as a prophet to denounce the dark reality that had taken hold in Israel. Amos was an ordinary man, but his message was like the roar of a lion, powerful and impossible to ignore. Amos 1 verse 2. He came from Judah, the southern kingdom, but was called to prophesy to the northern kingdom, warning that unjust and idolatrous behavior would bring serious consequences. His mission was to confront the people and their leaders with a harsh but true message. God could no longer bear to watch the oppression of the poor and the indifference of the elite. Amos was a lone voice crying out for justice, questioning the complacency and insensitivity that had taken over the nation. Amos did not speak on his own behalf or based on personal interests. He was a spokesman for God, conveying God's displeasure at injustice and religious superficiality. He called for a change of behavior and a sincere return to the true God of Israel. Amos' words were a call to repentance and transformation of life, asking the people to abandon greed and hypocrisy and embrace a life of justice and righteousness. In Amos 5 verse 24, he expresses God's desire, "But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." This is one of the most powerful passages in the book, where God expresses his desire to see constant and renewing justice among the people. Thus, the historical context of Israel in Amos' time was one of apparent prosperity, but with a fragile moral and spiritual foundation. The prophet's message continues to resonate today, warning us of the dangers of indifference, injustice, and empty religiosity. Amos' mission reminds us that God sees beyond appearances and judges based on justice and truth, calling us to a genuine commitment to him and to our neighbors. The prophet Amos is known for the forcefulness with which he denounced the social injustices of his time. In his message, social justice appears as the core of God's cry, a fundamental requirement for the people of Israel to be able to walk in harmony with the divine will. Amos does not simply observe the behavior of the society of his time. He reveals God's displeasure with a nation that neglected to care for its neighbors, prioritizing the accumulation of wealth and its own status. Amos' voice is strong and direct in pointing out that, without justice and righteousness, religious practice is empty and worthless. Amos incisively denounces the oppression of the poor, criticizing the leaders and powerful people of Israel who enriched themselves at the expense of those most in need. The poor were exploited, forced to work for low wages, and often oppressed by corrupt leaders who manipulated the laws to ensure that the lowest classes of society had no voice or rights. Injustice was structural, permeating all spheres of society, from the courts to commerce, where fraudulent and dishonest measures were used to harm the less fortunate. Amos explains that God was deeply saddened by this situation, and that judgment would be inevitable if there were no transformation. The verse from Amos 5 verse 24 is one of the most striking passages in the book and clearly expresses God's vision of social justice. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Here, Amos uses the image of a river of living water to symbolize God's desire to see righteousness flowing unceasingly. This call is a powerful metaphor, for an ever-flowing stream never dries up or stops its course. It is constant, sustaining life around it. Thus, God desires that righteousness be an uninterrupted part of the people's lives, a daily practice that does not depend on circumstances or convenience, but that is a reflection of God's character. For Amos, religious practice without a commitment to righteousness and love for one's neighbor has no value before God. The prophet shows that the sacrifices, feasts, and ceremonies were faithfully observed by the people, but they were devoid of sincerity and a compassionate spirit. In Amos 5 verses 21 to 23, God rejects these rituals. "I hate and despise your feasts. I take no pleasure in your solemn assemblies." God's indignation is due to the people's hearts being far from him. They worshipped with their lips, but their actions did not reflect God's will. Amos' message is clear. God does not want empty sacrifices, but a true change of heart that manifests itself in actions of kindness, equity, and care for the less fortunate. Amos' denunciation also applies to leaders who, instead of exercising their power to promote justice, used their positions to gain advantages and subjugate the weak. This abuse of power was widely practiced, and Amos confronts these leaders, stating that their position gave them the responsibility to defend the oppressed, not to exploit them. God desired a leadership that would serve the people, promoting justice and the common good. Amos' criticism points out that when leaders fail to fulfill this purpose, the entire society suffers the consequences of oppression and inequality. The vision of social justice conveyed by Amos is not limited to the context of ancient Israel. It challenges us to this day to reflect on our commitment to our neighbors. Amos' message is a reminder that true spirituality includes a deep sense of responsibility towards those who are in vulnerable situations. It is not enough to simply perform acts of worship or follow traditions. God expects faith to translate into concrete actions that promote justice, respect, and human dignity. It is a call to a life in which justice and mercy are constant and genuine practices. Amos teaches us that true worship of God is linked to how we treat our neighbors, especially those most in need. God does not want a religiosity of appearances, but rather a living practice of love and justice that flows like a river, bringing life and renewal. This is the true essence of Amos' message and the divine cry that echoes to this day. Amos is blunt in denouncing the religious hypocrisy of his time. He does not hesitate to expose the chasm between the external religiosity of the people and the true will of God. The society of Israel was full of rituals, sacrifices, feasts, and songs, but something essential was missing: a life of righteousness and commitment to justice. The prophet makes it clear that, for God, it was not enough to simply fulfill religious practices. What he really wanted was for the hearts of the people to be aligned with his values of love, justice, and integrity. In Amos 5 verses 21 to 23, the Lord expresses his displeasure with the feasts and offerings that the people brought. I despise your feasts, and I take no pleasure in your solemn assemblies. And though you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, nor will I regard the peace offerings of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs, for I will not listen to the melody of your instruments. This passage is one of the most powerful in the book, where God declares that all the ceremonies, songs, and offerings had no value for him, for they were just empty rituals. Religious gestures did not reflect a life truly dedicated to God and others. The problem was that the people continued to practice injustices and live in sin, but they believed that religious rituals could compensate for their actions and keep them in good standing with God. Instead of being true worshippers, they became mere ritualists. In criticizing this superficiality, Amos reveals that God values sincerity and authenticity above any sacrifice. The message was clear. God is not impressed by elaborate ceremonies or the most beautiful songs if the people's hearts are far from his will. Israel's religious hypocrisy was closely linked to indifference toward others. The rich and powerful fulfilled their religious duties, but exploited and neglected the poor and needy. This attitude is a clear deviation from true worship, because genuine faith is not limited to external actions, but manifests itself in true love for others. Amos reminds us that God does not accept a religiosity of appearances and that he sees beyond ceremonies. He searches the heart and is concerned with the character and attitudes of each person. For Amos, empty religion, devoid of transformation and love for others, is an affront to the very character of God. He teaches us that worshiping God goes far beyond rituals and ceremonies. It means living a life of integrity and seeking justice, defending those who have no voice, and being honest in our relationships. Without an internal transformation and an attitude of love and compassion, all rituals and offerings are useless in the eyes of God. Amos' message about religious hypocrisy is timeless. To this day, it challenges us to evaluate our own faith and religious practices. Are our worship and adoration of God true and come from a sincere heart? Are we living according to divine principles, or are we just maintaining a facade of religiosity? Amos warns us that God desires sincerity and justice above any appearance of holiness. Religious hypocrisy was one of the greatest problems in Israel in Amos' time, and the prophet's message echoes to this day, urging that our worship be genuine and that our faith translate into actions that reflect God's love and justice. Amos teaches that God does not just want rituals, but hearts committed to his will and to the good of others, a worship that comes from the soul and transforms our way of life. Amos brought a clear and harsh message to Israel. If there was no repentance, destruction would be inevitable. He was not a prophet of empty threats, but someone with a realistic and God-inspired vision of the future of a kingdom that stubbornly ignored the principles of justice and righteousness. His prophetic warning was an urgent call for the people to recognize their errors and return to God, abandoning the pride and idolatry that dominated Israel's heart. However, Israel, living in a time of prosperity and apparent security, was blinded by pride and self-sufficiency. Many thought that wealth and power were proof that God was still on their side. But Amos warned that this false security was a dangerous trap. He warned that judgment would come like a consuming fire, Amos 1 verse 4, and that God could no longer tolerate the injustice and hypocrisy that marked the lives of the people. This challenging message exposed the reality that pride and self-confidence would not be enough to stop God's righteous hand. Amos announced that without repentance, Israel's destruction was certain. His prophecy was clear. The God who shakes the earth, Amos 9 verse 5, would bring disaster upon the nation. The northern kingdom, which was militarily strong, economically stable, and influential in the region, had no idea that it could fall so quickly. But years later, in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire invaded and conquered Israel, fulfilling Amos' prophecy. The capital, Samaria, was destroyed, and the people were exiled. This tragic outcome was the result of a refusal to listen to and obey God's call to live a life of righteousness. Amos' warning message remains relevant today, as it reminds us that God's justice never fails. In the long run, sin, injustice, and disregard for God's principles lead to inevitable consequences. Like Israel, individuals and even nations can often delude themselves into thinking that their wealth, status, or power guarantee security. But the prophet Amos shows us that God is a God of justice, and his patience has limits. He calls us to sincere repentance and to seek a life that reflects his values of love and righteousness. Amos speaks of the day of the Lord as a time of judgment. Many in Israel expected that this day would bring salvation only to them, but Amos warns that for their sins, they too would be judged. The day of the Lord would not be a day of joy for Israel, but of sorrow, for God judges sin no matter where it is. Amos 5 verses 18 to 20. Despite his harsh warnings, Amos closes with a message of hope. God promises to restore the people and bring back the faithful remnant. In Amos 9 verses 11 to 15, there is a promise of rebuilding, where God would restore David's tent and bring peace and prosperity. This points to the future, to redemption and the coming of the Messiah, who would fulfill this promise of restoration. Amos reminds us that God is just and cares about how we treat one another. His message is a warning to nations, churches, and people of all times. Justice, love, sincerity, and faith. True faith is essential to please God. Amos challenges us to examine our hearts and live an authentic faith that cares about others and seeks justice. So, what did you think of this important warning? Leave your answer below in the comments. See you in the next video.